The next step I think I might want to take at this point then is a rather large one. What I think I might want to do at this point is to move validation into the object itself. Really, it seems to me that it's the object itself that should be able to decide whether the values that are stored in it or not are valid, rather than having a separate external page make that decision. So all of this business I have in here for my validation, I want to move into the color class itself. That also then means that I'm going to need to probably move the errors array into the class itself, which again seems appropriate to me. It seems like I should be able to go to a color itself and ask that color, are you valid or are you not? So there's going to be a number of different changes that will need to take place concerning that big move in validation. The other big decision that I have to make concerning validation is, when does the validation actually occur? What constitutes an invalid color and at what point in its life? The way we had worked with our objects previously, when we were doing our box example, for example, was that we validated data as it was actually coming into the object. And we could actually do that with colors here, except that I would say that it is not terribly important with a color if it is considered valid or not until it comes time to actually save the object. So I don't want to immediately validate data going into the color object. I only really want to validate it specifically when I'm going to save it. I think maybe what I would like to do is, in the color class, I would like to maybe add a validate function that I could call, and then I could decide at what point I actually want validation to take place. To actually do that, let me go ahead here and say that every color object that's created will have an errors array. I'll start it off as blank. Let me also then say that every colors object will have a validate function that can be called. When I call the validate function, I'd want the validate function to go through and decide whether the object is valid or not. The way we were doing that before was with regular expressions, passing them over to this validate function that was a separate standalone function on its own. I want to do pretty much the same thing here, except inside the object itself. Where is the object, though, going to get access to those regular expressions? Well, I'm thinking maybe what I will do is, inside the class itself, I'm going to say that every object has a private data member. Maybe I'll call it patterns. And what I'm going to do with patterns is I'm going to set it up to be an array where for each individual field, I will specify what the regular expression is to validate that particular field. So for the ID, I think I'll say it has to be a digit 0 through 9 repeated one or more times. For my name field, I'm going to say that my regular expression has to have one letter, upper, lowercase, or digit, repeating one or more times in it. For red value, I'm going to say my regular expression is that I have to have the values A through F, or the digits 0 through 9, repeating exactly 2 times. And then I'll do the same thing for my green value and for my blue value. So then I should have everything I need to be able to validate the object stored here inside this patterns array. The patterns array, now that I think about it, doesn't really need to belong to the object itself. It could belong to the class. So I think I might cut it out of this particular section of the class and move it back up here to the top. And I'm going to declare it as being static. Probably doesn't really make much difference whether I leave it where it was or move it here. One way or another, it'll be available. I guess the real question becomes, will I ever need it separate from an object itself? By making it static, I at least have the option of accessing it directly from the class, whereas if it was an instance variable, there would always have to be a color object there for me to get that data from. Down in my actual validate function then, I should be able to use a for each loop to go through and access all of those different patterns. I could say for each one of this class's patterns, taking each one as the name of the field that it goes with and the actual pattern itself. Then I could do an if statement. In the if statement, I could do my preg match. With the preg match, I start off by giving it the pattern, and then for the actual value that I want it to compare that pattern against, I will say to go to this object and to access the attribute whose name is whatever the name was from patterns. So in my patterns array, if the name I pull up is red value, and I have the regular expression for validating a red value, then I'm going to take red value, the attribute from this object. That's going to be the value I work with, and I'm going to compare it against that pattern. Preg match will then give me back some value. Will let me know whether it matched or if it didn't. I'm going to say if it doesn't match, then what I want to do is I want to put an error into the errors array. So I'll say for this object into its errors array, I did call it errors, didn't I? Yeah, there it is right there. Into its errors array, into an element whose name matches the name, I will store an error message. What error message to store? Boy, that always seems like the question. We've fought with this problem before, haven't we? For right now, to keep things as simple as I can, let's just say the $name field is not valid. Maybe later we can work on finding a way to be able to make that a little bit more specific. I'm also then going to put an else in here. What I'm going to do with this else is I'm going to say unset from this object's errors array any field for this particular name. The idea being that if we validate an object more than once, if we validated it once and we put an error into the errors array for a field, red value for example, and then we validate it again after a change has been made, this will give us the possibility of wiping out an error that it may have been there previously. The one other thing maybe I'll do with the validate function, it is already then populating, should already at least be populating my errors array. But when it's done, I think I would also maybe like to have it return something like a true or false. So if I don't need the error messages specifically, but instead just generally need to know, is it valid or isn't it, I could return a value from here. Or maybe even to make things a little bit more clear, instead of returning a value from there, maybe what I should do is have a separate function. What if I made another function? I'll call it valid. And then what I could do is I could figure out if there's any errors in the errors array. I could say if the count of this object's errors array, if it's greater than 0, so if there's errors in the errors array, then return true. Otherwise, return false. Actually, that should be the other way around, isn't it? If there are errors in the errors array, then the object's not valid, so I should say false. Otherwise, return true. I guess I could have said if the count of the errors is equal to 0, but one way or another, that should work okay. So that might be our validation moved over into the color class. Let's see what effect that's going to have on the new page then. On the new page, that should then mean that all this validation that I have here goes away. And instead of having my errors array, as I have it up here, I can get rid of that. And I could instead, down here when I'm checking for the errors, I could just ask the color itself if it's valid. In order for that to work though, I guess I need to have called my validate function. So before that happens, let me call validate for the color itself. So the basic process then becomes, if the form has been submitted, create an object out of the submitted form data, validate that data, and then if the object is valid, go through the process of actually saving the color. Seems logical. We'll see if it works or not. There's probably a few other changes that we're going to have to make too because of that. Is there anywhere else in here that we're using the errors array? Looks like we are right here. Oh, that's an additional error that's being pushed into the error array. We're probably going to want to handle that a different way. I'm just going to wipe that out for right now. What about over on my new page? On the new page itself, right here, we're actually displaying any errors that happen to be present. Those errors are now inside the object itself. If I need to be able to access the errors from the object itself, right now the errors are private, so I would need to provide some way for that to happen. Maybe what I could do here is in the get function, I could say if what we're trying to get is, if the name of what we're trying to get is errors, then return this object's errors array. And if that isn't true, then we come down and we will just return whatever was asked for. So on the new page then, that would then mean that I could say for my color object, ask for the thing called errors. Errors should be returned there and we can use it. So we'll use that there and we'll use it here in the for each loop when we display the errors itself. My form itself also uses the errors. Since the errors are now a part of the color object itself, that should mean that the errors don't even need to be passed to my text field function at all. So let me just not pass errors. So we're down to just 3 arguments potentially being passed to our text field function now. And in the text field function itself, we'll still be passed the name, we'll be passed an object, but the errors are now part of that object, so it doesn't have to be passed at all. Down here, when I go to actually use the errors, that's now going to be this errors. I can access the individual name from the errors array that's returned. And is there anywhere else in here that we need the errors array? I think that is basically it. Well, let's go back to the browser and try it and see what we've broken this time. In the browser on my index page, the index page itself isn't popping up. It's saying I have an error on line 9 of my color file. Let's see what I broke. Line 9 of my color file is down here where I'm creating my patterns. It looks like I forgot a comma there after the ID. I'll put that in, save, back to the browser, refresh. There we go, the index page pops up now. If I go to the new page, we have a breakage there. Forms library, line 7, $this is not an object context. So forms library, line 7, oh, I said $this because we've been working in the color class so much I had this on the mind. Here, this variable should be called object. Object is what was passed to this function, so it's object that I should use. In the browser, the form now pops up. Validation doesn't exactly look like it's working correctly. In the new page on line 7, probably that same mistake I made. So in my new page, line 7, sure enough I said this again. That should have been color. Refresh in the browser. There it looks like validation is basically working. Partial validation seems to work. And if I put in some values, it comes back and tells me the ID field is no valid. I've got a little typo there. Let me see, let's fix that typo real quick. Here in the validate functions, my little typo, let me make that not instead of no. The basic reason for that problem then is that it is trying to validate our ID. Do we really want it to validate the ID? Possibly. I certainly don't want to try saving a color without an ID. Why is it saying that my ID is invalid? The way we set up validation for our ID, the pattern that we were using, is that the ID has to be the values 0 through 9. Well, how's that actually happening? Or how are we not having a 0 through 9 for our ID? Well, the value of color, the value in our colors array, or in the colors object that we're trying to validate, look like they came here from the post array. The post array wouldn't have had an ID, so we probably would have ended up with something just blank, no actual ID being put in. When we then try to call validate right there, sure enough, that wouldn't work, would it? Do we want there to be an ID? Is it actually important that we validate the ID? Maybe not as important as I was thinking it is. Let's just wipe that out. Let's just say we're going to validate name, red value, green value, and blue value and see how that goes. In the browser, if I refresh again, it seems like it created my color, test with all Fs. Let's try it one more time. Validation's there. Partial validation. I'll call this the B color. Very green. That's what we end up getting, so it seems like it's working okay now. So again, we're one step closer to having this thing more object-oriented than it was before. What's left? Well, what's left at this point is sort of the big part in a lot of ways. The part of our new page that is most closely connected with how the colors are stored in a file is still something that we actually have here in the new page itself. I think what I would actually like to do at this point is wipe that out and move that inside the color object itself. Here's what I'm thinking, is that my new page at this point, I think I would like for it to become, basically when the page first loads, we start with a blank color. If the form submitted, create a color object from that submitted form data. Then here, instead of calling valid, what I want to do is I want to call save. I want to save the color at that point. When I actually save the color, what it should then, I think, do is return to me a true or a false, just letting me know whether it's saved correctly or not. If it's saved correctly, then save should return true, and we should redirect to the show page. If it returns false, and we don't save, then I would want to stay here on the new form page and let the user see the errors and correct whatever problem it was that prevented the color from saving. So I think this in this final step is what I would like to see my new page be reduced down to. Let's see, how are my curly braces here? I think I have an extra curly brace there. Nope, I think that one actually belonged. I suppose that's probably the extra. Let me change it to something like that. So logically, I think this is what I'd like the page to become. Now, how are we actually going to make that happen? Well, there's again going to be lots of different options, lots of different ways I could potentially put this together. But what I think I would like to do is I think I'd like to set up my color class so that whenever a new color is added, what I want to happen is I really just want that color to be added to the list of all colors that I may have already loaded from my file. Then I'll have the class itself take all colors and save them back to the file. So my thinking is that every time a new color is added, every color gets rewritten. The entire file gets rewritten. The reason I want to do it that way is I think that will probably also then make my job of doing the update page the easiest, because I could reuse more of that same code. When we get to the update page, it would allow me to update a color that we already have loaded from the file, update it in an array in memory, and then just write the whole thing back to the file again. So let me kind of work in that direction. What I'm proposing with the new page is that I'm going to need a new function here called save that I'll call for a color. So for a color itself, let me go ahead and add a save function, public function save. And certainly one of the very first things I want the save function to do is I want it to validate the color. So the validate function is kind of being moved inside the object itself. So I don't have to call it externally. Instead, it'll be called automatically whenever I try to save the object. We only then want to proceed with actually saving the object if validation goes correctly. So after I call validate, I'll say if this object is valid, then we'll go ahead and proceed with the saving. And hopefully at the end of that we'll return true or something along those lines. If the object isn't even valid, then let's just return false. That false being returned from save will end up coming back to the if statement on my new page, which will then prevent me from being redirected to the show page. Instead, I'll stay here on the new page so that the user can see errors. So that's the beginning of my save function. When the object itself is actually valid, I think what I'd like to do is I would like to have it put into the array of all colors that are loaded. In order for that to happen, I have to have all of my colors. So let me say for all of my colors, go to this class and call all. Now this is one of those situations that I imagined was going to come up. Remember when we set up the all function, I set it up so that it would automatically give us back the colors if they were already loaded and would not try to load them again. Well, this is, I think, going to be one of those situations where we might have tried to load them once already. Well, maybe not. One way or another, it's reassuring to know that it won't be trying to load them more than one time. But here, I'll have all of my colors actually loaded. If this color is valid, then I want to add this color to the colors array. Where I want to put it in the colors array is into the position that corresponds with its ID, but this object doesn't have an ID yet. So this is where I now want to go through and actually find the next available ID. So like we were doing before, let me make a variable called last ID. I'll set it to 0. Then I'll say for each of all of the colors, taking each one as color, if that individual color's ID is greater than what I have stored for the last ID, then let me set last ID equal to a pre-incremented, actually just set it to that color's ID. So last ID will always be the greatest ID that we find in all the colors, just like what we had before. And then finally, to make this object's ID correct, I'll say set this object's ID to a pre-incremented version of last ID. So that's where we go one step beyond whatever the last ID used was. And once that's done, this new color that we're trying to save should then have its ID and can be put into the colors array. So I could then say into the colors array, into the position indicated by this object's ID, store this object. Once this object has joined all the other colors in the colors array itself, I would then want to save it. I guess the only trick there then is that that colors array is a local colors array here, not necessarily the master colors array, the static colors array up at the top. So while I could use this colors array for going through and figuring out what the next ID is, down here when I actually want to put this color with all the others, I want that to be into that master color array. So let me do self : dollar colors there. So this color then joins all the others in that static colors array, which should exist and should be full because I know I've just called all right here above. Until I think of something better, I think that should work. The last thing to do then is that I want to take all of the colors, including this new color that was just added, and I want to save them all. So how about if I make a new function called save all? I'll make it a static function that should go through and save every color back to the file again. That's a new function that doesn't exist right now, so I'll have to go create it. Before I leave this little bit of function behind, how about I say return whatever value is returned by save all. So if save all appears to succeed, we'll have it return true, and that true will then be returned from save here, so that the new page will then know that the color was correctly saved and can redirect the user over to the show page. On the other hand, if something goes wrong with save all here, it could return false. That false would be returned here from this save function. That would then be sent back to the new page, so the new page would know not to redirect the user over to the show page. All right, let's go see about creating this save all function then. Back up near the top of my class where I was creating all my other static attributes and functions, let me add in a new public function, a new public static function. I'll call it save all. And what I want this save all function to do is just go through all of my colors that I have here, save them all to my file name, whatever that may happen to be. There it is. And then return true or false, letting us know whether it worked or not. So here inside save all, I suppose we need to start by opening our file. Boy, it feels like forever since the last time I actually did that. Let me open my file. The file's name is in a static variable called file name. And I'm going to open the file in write mode, so it will wipe out any colors that were there before and we will overwrite them. Then, if we have access to our file, we'll go on and actually save. If for some reason we can't access the file, then I'm going to return false, so the new page will know that things did not go well. If I was able to actually access the file, then I suppose I will need to do a for loop. I'll say for each of this class's colors, taking each one as color. I want to write each of those colors, so I will write to my file that particular color. That will again call that color's toString function, so that color will basically format itself as a tab delimited string with a new line at the end, which will then be written out to the file. Once that's done, I'll close my file, and then I guess I will return true, so that whoever called save all will know that the process appears to have been a success. Think it'll work? No telling. Definitely it'd be a good idea at this point to go ahead and back up the color file, the color.txt file, before we give this a try to make sure we don't lose anything. Let me jump over to the browser now and let's see how it goes. Here on my index page, it seems to load up okay. If I go over to my new page, validation is there. Partial validation is there. I misspelled test, but hey, that's okay. It is just a test after all. Let me try creating a color. Back at my index page, all my other colors appear to still be there, so we didn't destroy our data file. Test misspelled was created. The question is, why did I end up back over at my index page? It should have redirected me to the show page, shouldn't it? Let's try again. If I create a new color, blah, BB, sure enough, right back over to the index page. It created the color, but it's not taking me back to the show page as it should. Let's take a look at the new page and see why that might be. So on the new page, it should be returning true or false from save, and then redirecting me over to the show page. I have a suspicion here, I could be wrong, that save is returning true, that it is redirecting me to the show page, but maybe, oh yeah, look, last ID. There is no last ID anymore, is there? I think what was happening is last ID didn't exist, so when we redirected to the show page, there was no valid ID. So then it was the show page that was redirecting us to index. So this part was technically working in that it was trying to redirect us to show, but the show page was then kicking us back out because we weren't passing it a correct ID. What I should probably do here is say get the ID for the color that we just created. Let's give that another try. Back over on my index page again. I'll try to create another new color. Validation. I'll just call this one new color. For my code, let's do CC. Look at that. Thing of beauty. There we are. I think we have accomplished our goal. We've definitely added quite a bit over here to our color class. The color class now has the patterns that are used for validating colors stored in it. We also now inside the color class have the ability to save an entire collection of colors. We also have added to each individual color object the ability for it to validate itself, report whether it's valid or not, and the ability to trigger a save for itself. So quite a bit added there to our color class. That was definitely a lot of work, and it's by no means not complicated. But what we get as a payoff is our new page, which was several pages of code long before, has now become just this. And now that I think about it, we don't even need that line, do we? What happens now with our new page is whenever we first visit it, we get a blank color, and that blank color is what's shown in the form. Whatever default values we put in for a color are the default values that our form should show. When the form itself is actually submitted, we take the submitted values that are posted from our form, we use that to create a color object, and then we just, simple as can be, say, hey color, save yourself. It will attempt to save itself. It'll report back true or false. If the save succeeds, we redirect the user to the show page to see their new color. If save doesn't succeed, they stay here on the new page where they will then be looking at a form that will show them their validation problems. So that really cleaned up the new page considerably. It became a whole lot shorter than it was before. And our overall goal, you'll remember, was to isolate having everything to do with how the color is saved, how the color is actually stored. You can probably imagine at this point that if we did make some kind of substantial change to how colors are saved, like for example, if I changed so that colors were stored in a database, at this point there is nothing here on the new page that should require any changing at all. If I switch to a different technique for saving my colors, those changes will all happen entirely inside the color class. If I make this same sort of sweeping change on my edit page, on my destroy page, everywhere, then that would then mean that by editing nothing but my color class, I will be able to completely change the way that my color system works, which is what the goal was, to isolate the working with the color data, forming a proper model, so that our controllers, which is basically what this is, and our views will no longer have to be at all concerned with how colors are actually stored.